The termination letter was still warm from the printer when Diane Osei walked it out of the building. Her hands didn't shake. Her chin didn't drop. She folded the paper in half, slid it into the pocket of her chef's coat, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside Maison Laurent, one of the most celebrated French restaurants in Chicago, Michelin-starred. Reservation waitlist 4 months long, and breathed the cold November air like a woman who had been waiting for a door to open and had just realized she was the one who'd need to build it. She had been feeding people since she was 9 years old. She had cooked her way through a country that did not make it easy, built a reputation that belonged entirely to someone else's name, and survived 17 years in professional kitchens that chewed through people without apology. Now she was 41, fired, and standing outside a restaurant that had built its last 3 years of critical acclaim on recipes she had quietly perfected in a kitchen where no one ever asked her last name. The executive chef who had just handed her that letter was upstairs telling the remaining staff that changes had been made for the good of the team. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in 11 months, Diane Osei would own the building he was standing in. Rewind 8 years. The first time Diane walked into a professional kitchen, she was 23 years old and had been cooking on the street for 4 years. Not cooking as a hobby, cooking as survival, and as the one thing in her life that felt entirely, unambiguously hers. She had grown up the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants on the south side of Chicago. Her father, Emmanuel, drove a delivery truck. Her mother, Abina, cleaned offices in the Loop 5 nights a week. They were working people, steady, dignified, careful with money, generous with everything else. And their daughter had inherited all of it, plus something neither of them could fully explain. An instinct for food that bordered on preternatural. She could taste a dish and identify what was missing before she could articulate why. She understood balance, fat and acid, heat and sweetness, the way certain spices bloom differently in oil versus dry heat, the way some people understand music, by feel, by ear, without instruction. She started selling jollof rice and fried plantains out of her mother's kitchen at 19, supplying catering trays to churches and neighborhood events on weekends while she worked days at a pharmacy counter. By 21, she had a cart, a handmade awning, and a regular Thursday spot in a parking lot off 79th Street. By 23, her food had developed the kind of following that makes people cross neighborhoods they'd otherwise never visit. A food writer from the Tribune found her on a Tuesday in March, ate 2 plates of her groundnut stew standing up in the cold, and filed a paragraph about her that ran inside a larger feature on Chicago's street food scene. 6 sentences. They changed everything. The owner of a small French bistro in Lincoln Park read that paragraph the morning it published. His name was Gerard Fontaine. 64 years old, Lyon trained. 22 years running his restaurant with the particular stubbornness of someone who believes one approach to cooking is correct and all others are interesting experiments at best. He was not looking for a sous chef. He was not looking to expand his palate. He was looking for someone to cover lunch service while his cook recovered from hand surgery. And Gerard Fontaine was, at his core, a man who trusted his instincts about talent. He hired Diane on a 3-week trial. She stayed 7 years. What began as reheating stocks and prepping vegetables evolved into something neither of them had planned or entirely understood. Diane absorbed classical French technique the way she absorbed everything. Quietly, completely, with the precision of someone who is not performing diligence, but actually practicing it. She read Escoffier on her days off. She spent her own money eating at restaurants she couldn't afford because she needed to taste how other people solved the problems she was working through. And she began experimenting with applications she had invented herself. Techniques that lived in the space between French classical tradition and West African culinary logic. producing flavor combinations that had no established name but stopped people mid-bite and made them sit still for a moment. Gerard noticed. He raised her salary. He promoted her to sous chef. He told her, more than once, that she was extraordinary. He meant it. He also, more than once, presented her dishes to guests as evolutions of his own vision, and accepted the credit with the ease of a man who had never been asked to examine the origin of that credit too carefully. When Gerard retired and sold Fontaine's to a restaurant group in 2019, he told Diane about the sale the morning the papers signed. He thanked her warmly. He gave her an envelope with 3 months' severance. He did not offer her equity. He did not tell the buyers who had actually been cooking the food that made the restaurant worth acquiring. Diane understood. In that moment, every lesson she had not known she was learning. She stayed on for 6 months under the new management. Then, she was recruited by Maison Laurent. And she accepted. Because the money was real, and the kitchen was serious. And because Diane Osai was not the kind of person who let bitterness make decisions she'd have to live with. Maison Laurent was everything Fontaine's had aspired to be. 40 seats on the 16th floor of a boutique hotel in River North, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, Carrara marble walls, crystal stemware, a wine list that opened at $90 and a tasting menu at $285 per person. The executive chef was Philippe Renard, French-trained, 48, 2 cookbooks, a recurring spot on a cooking competition show, and an ego that arrived before he did. Philippe did not hire Diane to create. He hired her to execute. The vision was his. The concept was his. The brand was his. He made this clear in her first week, with the comfortable authority of a man who had never once been challenged on where his ideas came from. The problem Diane recognized within a month and never said aloud. Philippe's vision was real, but his hands had drifted. Years of television appearances, book tours, and keynote speeches had taken him out of the kitchen more than they had kept him in it. He knew exactly what he wanted food to taste like. He could increasingly no longer produce it himself. His presence in the kitchen had become more ceremonial than functional, tasting, commenting, adjusting by instruction rather than by touch. And a kitchen where the executive chef can't cook is a kitchen that needs someone who can. Diane could. So she did. Every service, every week, without announcement, without credit, without a revised title or a pay increase that matched what she was actually doing. She watched Philippe present at table, his descriptions, his gestures, his name printed on the menu cards, and she returned to the kitchen and ensured the next course was flawless. For 2 years, this was the arrangement, and for 2 years, Maison Laurent's reputation grew in direct proportion to the precision coming out of Diane's section of the kitchen. Here's what was happening that she didn't know about. Maison Laurent's parent company, a hospitality group called Meridian Collective, had been quietly struggling since 2020. 3 of its 6 properties had underperformed through the pandemic years. 2 had closed. Maison Laurent was the jewel, the one profitable, award-winning, nationally recognized asset keeping the entire portfolio from going under. Meridian's board was paying very close attention to what was keeping it alive, and Meridian's director of operations, a woman named Claire Novak, had been tracking something interesting in the data for 18 months. The restaurant's strongest critical reviews, its highest repeat reservation rates, and its best customer feedback scores all correlated with one variable: Philippe Renard's absence. When he was traveling for appearances, Diane ran the kitchen. Those were the months Maison Laurent was at its best. Claire had cross-referenced this pattern 6 ways. It held every time. She had also started paying attention to the Thursday development sessions. Every week at Maison Laurent, the kitchen held a 45-minute development meeting on Thursday mornings where Philippe announced the upcoming seasonal additions to the tasting menu. It was framed as his creative process made visible for the team. What it actually was, for the past 2 years, was Philippe receiving ideas from Diane and presenting them as the natural output of his own thinking. The routine was so established that Diane had stopped noticing the pattern as clearly as she should have. She would arrive prepared, sketches in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket, sometimes samples she'd prepped the evening before, and Philippe would taste, consider, and then describe back to her what he was envisioning using language close enough to hers that it was almost a mirror. Almost, but not quite. Because something was always slightly flattened in the translation. A spice combination would be simplified, a textural contrast would be removed for the sake of what Philippe called elegance, and what Diane privately understood as caution. The instinct of a cook who no longer fully trusted his own palate. The dish that broke the pattern came on a Thursday in October. Diane had been developing it for 3 weeks. A seared duck breast, French classical in structure, with a tamarind miso reduction and a charred citrus oil that had taken her 11 attempts to calibrate correctly. The flavor profile drew on her West African foundation in a way she had spent years learning how to express in the language of fine dining without losing the thing that made it true. She had tested it 6 times in her home kitchen before bringing it in. It was the most complete dish she had ever created, and she knew it the way you know something that took the entirety of who you are to make. Philippe tasted it, set down his fork, looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man receiving inspiration. Then he said the duck had potential, that he could see where it was going, and that he had actually been thinking about something in this direction himself. She nodded. She wrote nothing in her notebook. She went back to her station. He served it 6 weeks later, unmodified, exactly as she had made it, at a private dinner for 20 Chicago food critics and media figures that Meridian had organized as an end-of-year showcase. He described the dish's concept at the table. He talked about the balance of cultures, the discipline required to honor both traditions, without sentimentalizing either. He spoke about it with conviction, and the conviction was real, because the idea was good. He just hadn't had it. Every review from that evening mentioned the duck. Not one mentioned Diane. She went home that night and opened the wooden box on her kitchen counter where she kept the notebooks. 2 years of development records. Every idea dated. Every iteration logged. Every tasting note in her handwriting. She didn't look at them with anger. She looked at them with the focused attention of a woman understanding something completely for the first time, because she finally had enough information to see the full shape of it. She closed the notebooks. She made herself tea. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long time. Then, she made a decision. 3 weeks later, she was fired. A young line cook, eager, observant, still at the age when he believed that noticing things and saying them aloud were the same virtue, mentioned in passing to Philippe's sous chef that Diane had rearranged the prep sequence during the previous week's service while Philippe was at a food conference in Paris. The adjustment had been practical, a timing issue in the cold station that would have backed up the 4th course. Diane had fixed it in 4 minutes. The service had run flawlessly. But the sous chef, who understood hierarchy and loyalty, and whose side his future lived on, reported it upstairs within the hour. Philippe had been back from Paris for 2 days. He had sensed something shifting in Diane's demeanor since the October development session, without being able to name it precisely. Something in the way she had stopped bringing her notebook to the Thursday meetings, the way she answered his questions with shorter sentences, the way her eyes held a quality of assessment he found unsettling. He had been looking, for a reason. Now he had one. The meeting lasted 9 minutes. Philippe did the talking. An HR representative Diane had never met in 2 years of employment sat to his left and took notes with the focused neutrality of someone performing a function rather than witnessing a moment. Philippe used phrases like chain of command and team cohesion and misalignment of vision with the measured delivery of someone reading from a script he had practiced. Diane said nothing. She was not asked to say anything. When the HR representative slid the termination letter across the table, Diane read it once, top to bottom, with the same careful attention she brought to a new recipe, looking for the logic, noting what was present and what was absent. She signed the acknowledgement form. She stood up. She shook no one's hand. The letter cited failure to maintain chain of command and creating division within the kitchen team. It was signed by Philippe Renard and countersigned by Meridian's HR director, whose name Diane was reading for the first time. She folded it in half, put it in her coat pocket, and walked out into November. On the sidewalk, she stood for a moment. The Chicago River was visible from street level, 2 blocks west, gray and cold under a white sky, moving slowly. She had looked at it from the 16th floor every service for 2 years. It looked different from down here, not smaller, just truer. She called her brother from the sidewalk. He asked if she was okay. She told him she was better than she'd been in months. He asked what she was going to do. She told him she was going to get something to eat and then make some calls. She made 4 calls that evening. The first was to Claire Novak. Because 3 weeks before the firing, Claire Novak had called Diane first. She had introduced herself as Meridian's director of operations, told Diane she had been observing the kitchen's performance patterns for 18 months, and asked if Diane would be interested in a conversation about the company's plans for the property. Diane had listened to everything. She had asked one question, not about compensation, not about title, but about creative control. Claire's answer had been unambiguous. Diane had said she would need some time to think. She had been thinking about it every day since. The second call was to her accountant. The third was to a food and beverage attorney her friend in New York had used 2 years before. The fourth call was back to her brother to tell him to come over because there was a lot to explain and she needed to say it out loud to make sure it was real. She spread the notebooks across the kitchen table. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at her and said, "How long have you had all this?" She said, 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do with it?" She poured 2 cups of tea and told him exactly. The next 8 weeks moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for a moment she'd never been fully certain would arrive. The legal picture clarified faster than anyone expected, because Diane's notebooks were not ambiguous. 2 years of dated development entries, handwritten descriptions of dishes, tasting iteration notes, margin sketches of plating ideas, all time-stamped against the dates those dishes had appeared on Maison Laurent's menu, constituted, as her attorney said without embellishment, one of the clearest documentary records of intellectual contribution to a restaurant concept he had encountered in 15 years of food and beverage law. There was no dispute to manage. There was only a question of what Meridian wanted to do with the information. Meridian's board already knew what it wanted to do. Claire Novak had spent 18 months building a case, and the case was simple. Philippe Renard's brand had plateaued. His television deals had stalled. His second book had underperformed, and the analysis connecting Maison Laurent's critical and financial performance to Diane's presence in the kitchen was airtight. He had also, as the notebooks made clear, been presenting her intellectual work as his own for 2 years, which created a liability exposure that Meridian's general counsel did not want to manage in a public forum. Philippe's attorney spent a week reviewing the notebooks and his client's contract. The settlement was reached in 9 days. The press release said he was pursuing independent projects. It was accurate. It simply omitted why. Diane negotiated her own terms directly with Meridian's board in a single 2-hour meeting. She came prepared with a business plan, a 5-year financial model, and a redesigned menu concept. She left with a 40% equity stake in the property, full creative control, and her name on the door. Claire Novak, who had orchestrated the entire sequence with the patience of someone who had seen too many talented people get ground up by corporate structures that didn't know what they had, shook Diane's hand in the lobby afterward and said, "It's overdue." Diane said, "By about 8 years. The rebranding took 6 weeks. The new menu took 8. The name, Osei, was chosen not for its elegance, though it had that, but because it was her mother's name and her grandmother's name and the name of every woman in her family who had cooked without recognition for decades before she did. The night Osei reopened, there was a line outside the hotel that stretched half a block into the February cold. Every reservation for 3 months had been claimed within 40 minutes of the booking window opening. The tasting menu, $310 per person, 16 courses, a precise and luminous architecture of French classical technique and West African flavor tradition that had no real predecessor in Chicago fine dining, was reviewed by 4 major publications within 2 weeks of opening. Every one of them called it a revelation. 3 of them asked the same question: where had this chef been? She had been there the whole time. On the first Sunday after the relaunch, Diane arrived at the restaurant at 6:30 in the morning. Not because she had to. Because she always had. Because the food did not cook itself and the prep did not do itself, and mornings in a kitchen, before the noise and the rush and the heat of service, were the hours that actually determined what happened later. She came through the front entrance. The one with the brushed gold handles and the framed review in the lobby, the Tribune piece, the first major one, which had called the opening the most significant event in Chicago fine dining in a decade. She walked through the dining room. 40 seats, still 40 seats, the same windows overlooking the same river, and into the kitchen, which smelled like early stockwork and fresh herbs, and the particular clean smell of a kitchen where the equipment has been cared for. She put on her chef's coat, the new one, with her name above the breast pocket. Just her name. No title beneath it, because she had decided that the title was the name, and the name was enough. She pulled the small notebook from her coat pocket, not the old ones, which lived in the wooden box at home. The new one already half filled with the next ideas, the next dishes, the next evolution of the conversation between the 2 culinary traditions she had held simultaneously her entire life. She had been told, in various ways and by various people over 17 years, that this combination was too niche, too unfamiliar, too difficult to explain to a fine dining audience. She had discovered, or rather, she had always known, and the world had finally caught up, that the opposite was true. That food which comes from the genuine intersection of 2 complete traditions, handled with full knowledge of both, produces something with more depth and more truth than either alone. Her sous chef arrived at 7. A young woman from Atlanta she had recruited specifically because she asked hard questions and pushed back when something wasn't right, and made the food better every time she was in the room. She said good morning and used Diane's name and poured them both coffee without being asked. Diane handed her the notebook, open to the current page. They stood at the prep counter in the early morning quiet, the river visible through the glass, pale winter light coming in flat and clear, and talked through the next idea together, because that's what a kitchen was supposed to be. Not one person's monument. A collaboration, with credit where it was due, built on the understanding that food made honestly is the most democratic thing there is. She had learned this on a sidewalk on 79th Street, selling plates from a cart, feeding strangers who became regulars, who became, in some cases, the first people in her life to tell her exactly what she was worth. It turned out they were right.